Hi everyone, it's Dan. I'm here with my second video in my mini-series of 3 looking at single pawn endgames. In the first video, I looked at opposition and the rule of the square. If you have not seen that video, you can click on the link on the screen. I highly suggest you see it, especially if you don't know what opposition is, because opposition is going to be very important in this and the next video. The subject of this video is going to be fairly narrow. We're just going to look at some instances in which generally the side with the extra pawn should be able to win, but there are going to be a couple of different caveats, and we'll look at some ways that the side with the extra pawn will not be able to win, even though it looks like maybe he or she should be able to. Now, the general rule when you're trying to promote a single pawn is you want your king in front of the pawn, and you want your king in front of the pawn at least by one space. So there should be one space between the king and the pawn. But obviously the caveat here is going to be that the pawn is not going to be subjected to any sort of immediate danger. So if we look at this position right here, it looks like white should be able to win this without any problem at all. The only thing that white needs to be careful is not to get too carried away and to try to get the king even further ahead of the pawn. So moving king to f6 here is actually going to draw, because after king e3 there's no way to save the pawn. Okay, so let's look at kind of a more standard position where one side, in this instance white, is going to have an extra pawn, and how is white going to be able to promote that pawn. So in this position, first we're going to assume that it's black's turn, and if it's black's turn, the win's going to be fairly straightforward. First of all, like I said, opposition is going to be very important. If it's black's turn, we can recognize that black is forced to yield the opposition, which means white has the opposition. So in this kind of endgame, it's really important, if you're the side that's trying to win, to have the opposition. If you're the side that's trying to draw to keep the pawn from promoting, you're also going to need the opposition. We will look at that in the third and final video in this series. But for now, let's look at see what happens when it's black's turn and black is forced to yield the opposition. So black here is cut off from the 5th rank. If black moves backwards up to the 7th rank, then that's great. We're able to just push our king forward. And let's see what happens if the king moves to the side along the 6th rank. Let's say the black king moves to e6. So the technique here is going to be to move the white king up and away from the black king. So if the black king went to e6, the white king is just going to push to g5. And then once the black king gets back on the f file, which is the file the pawn is on, now white takes the opposition again. And we're going to repeat the process. Let's say that here black plays king to g7. We're going to move up and away, so we're going to move king to e6. And black is going to move back over to the f file to try to get in front of the pawn. And now white takes the opposition again. Now at this point, we've got enough space between our king and our pawn that we don't need to make any more progress with our king. At this point, we need to start getting our pawn closer to the queen square. So let's say that the black king here is just going to shuffle back and forth. He's going to play king e8. We're going to push our pawn forward, king f8, and now we've got our pawn as far forward as we can push it right now. So now it's black's turn. Black again needs to break the opposition. Let's say black moves king to g8. We're just going to do what we did before. We're going to move up and away to e7. And as you can see now, our king is protecting the final 3 squares that our pawn needs to pass through in order to promote. So the king is protecting f6, f7, and f8, which means the black king, no matter what he does, is not going to be able to stop our pawn. So let's say the king moves to g7. We're just going to push forward, king g8, push forward again, king g7, and then we get a queen. And that was just an example. It really doesn't matter which squares the black king moves to. Since he cannot get back in front of the pawn, our pawn is going to be able to promote. Now, as I said before, it is really important for the side that is trying to promote the pawn to have the king at least one square in front of the pawn. So there needs to be one square of space on the board between the king and the pawn. And the reason for this is, again, it has to do with opposition. So let's say in this position it's white's turn. And let's just imagine for a second that the pawn is not able to move. So if it was white's turn in this position, we could say that white is forced to yield the opposition, black has the opposition, and so what that means is no matter what white does, black is going to be able to stop the white king from pushing forward. Now, obviously in this example, white does have an extra pawn. And so the reason that you need the king to be at least one square in front of the pawn is so that you can burn a tempo. So the correct move here is actually going to be push the pawn to f3. And now it's black's turn, and black doesn't have any other pieces to move, and so now black is going to have to yield the opposition. And from here, it actually looks exactly like the example that we just looked at. The king moves back, we push our king up and away, we start getting our pawn closer, and then we finally get our king in position to guard the final 3 squares, and black is powerless to stop us as we get a queen. This game is going to be a win for white. Now, just by way of illustration and in order to be thorough, I just wanted to show you exactly what it looks like with white is not able to burn a tempo with the pawn. So in this example, the pawn is already on f3. There is no space for the pawn to move. And so if it's white's turn, this is going to be a draw no matter what white does. So let's say that the white king moves, the black king is going to follow and take the opposition, right? White had to yield the opposition, black takes it again. And here, white can either just keep shuffling back and forth, and we can see that there's just going to be no progress made, or white might try to push the pawn forward now instead and push pawn to f4. Well, the problem with this position is that now the king is no longer in front of the pawn, the king is to the side of the pawn. And that's actually going to be the focus of the next video that I'll put out on this series, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But the important thing to remember is that if you want to promote your pawn and you need your king's help to do it, your king needs to be in front of the pawn. It's usually not going to be enough for the king to be next to the pawn or behind the pawn. So in this position, this is also going to be a draw. However, if we go back to the initial position and we now imagine that it is black's turn to move, well, fortunately for white, it doesn't matter that the pawn doesn't have a space to move to because now black is the one that has to yield the opposition, and we're going to employ the exact same strategy. Black breaks the opposition, and we're going to move our king up and away, and from this position, by now you guys should be able to figure out exactly how white would win this. Now, I just said that if the king is directly in front of the pawn and the pawn has no extra square to move to, and it is white's turn in a position like this, that usually the position is going to end in a draw. The only exception is if the king is already on the 6th rank for white, or it would be the 3rd rank for black. So in this position, even though it's white's turn, this is going to end up a win for white. There's nothing black can do to stop it. So let's look at exactly what that looks like. So let's say it's white's turn. White's going to move to e6. Black is going to take the opposition. Well, now you can push the pawn forward, and real quick, here the black king has nowhere to run backwards to. So if the king right now only has 2 squares to move to, d8 or f8. If the king moves to d8, he's obviously moving too far away from the pawn, and so you're not going to be able to stop the pawn from promoting. If you move to f8 to try to get back in front of the pawn, at this point, white can again push the pawn forward. And the really important thing is that the pawn is pushing forward without check, which means now the only square that the black king has to move to is going to be g7. And at this point, we just scoot our king up, and then we're able to promote. So again, if the king that is trying to promote its pawn is already on the 6th rank, and even though it's white's turn in the position, white is going to be able to win this. And if it's black's turn, then it's even more direct. Black is just going to move, and we're going to use the exact same strategy that we've already looked at. Move our king up and away, cover all 3 of the final squares, and then push our pawn through to promotion. Now, everything that we just looked at applies for pawns that are on files B, C, D, E, F, and G. However, pawns on the A file or the H file, or otherwise known as rook pawns, are a little bit more difficult to promote. They're also easier to defend against if you're the side that's trying to draw. So the secret to ensuring that you are going to be able to promote a rook pawn, in this instance white is trying to promote the A pawn, is to get the king to b7. It's not enough to have the king influencing that square. The king needs to be on b7 or b8. If the white king is able to get to b7, white will win this game. If the black king is able to get to b7, or at least keep the white king from actually physically getting to b7, then the game will be a draw. So let's imagine that in this instance it is white's turn. Both sides are going to try to race to the a8 corner, right? Black is trying to get in front of the pawn and to cut the king off. If the king is able to get into the corner on a8, if the black king is able to get to a8, there's not going to be a way for white to kick the king out of the corner and promote the pawn. However, in this instance, we will see that white is actually going to be able to get to b7, which cuts the king off from the corner. At this point, the pawn starts to push. The black king has to try to go around the white king, but it's too late, and the pawn is going to be able to promote, and this is going to be a win for white. So again, if you're trying to promote your rook pawn, you need to get your king to the square b7, g7, b2, or g2. If you are able to get your king physically on those squares, you're good. You're going to be able to win the game. Now let's go back to the initial position and imagine that it is black's turn. What we will see is that black is actually going to be able to stop the white king from physically getting to b7. And so at this point, white has a choice, but the choice is, how does white want to draw the game? White is not going to be able to promote this pawn no matter what he does. So let's say first that the king plays to a7, right? He's thinking, if I can just keep the black king out of the corner, then maybe I'll be able to promote my pawn eventually. But in fact, all black needs to do here is play king to c7, and we can see that now black has the opposition. Remember, we talked about how opposition usually occurs along the ranks, but opposition can also occur along the files. And so now, no matter what white does, black is going to have the opposition. If white here tries to push the pawn forward, then all black needs to do is shuffle back and forth between c7 and c8, so king to c8, pawn pushes, king to c7, pawn pushes, king to c8. And at this point, if white tries to get out of the way of his own pawn, then this is actually going to allow black to sneak into the corner, and this is going to be stalemate. Alternatively, if white tries to push forward with his own king gets stuck in the corner. And if the pawn pushes forward, then now white is actually going to be in stalemate, and this is going to end in a draw. So that'll do it for this video. Again, it was pretty narrowly focused on exactly what the technique is to make sure that you are able to promote your pawn if you are the side that has an extra pawn in a king and pawn endgame. And also, we looked at a couple of strategies for how to draw the game if you're the defending side. The focus of the third and final video is going to be exactly what kind of positions will lead to a draw no matter what the attacking side tries to do. So definitely follow the link that's on the screen right now to get to the third video. I hope you've found this one to be enjoyable and instructional as well. You can feel free to leave a comment or a question, and thanks for watching. Bye.